probably one of the most distinguished fellows here in McLaughlin College, presenting our lunchtime talk, Howard Adelman. He probably needs no introduction to the people here at York University, but for the new students that are joining us, Howard is probably one of the most widely and extensively published academics in the field of refugee studies. In fact, he's probably one of the founders of the field of refugee studies. He's done so much throughout his life and career. He's one of the founders of Rochdale College at the University of Toronto. He's one of the founders of the Refugee Studies Center here at York University, the second center of its kind in the world. And McLaughlin College does have this tradition of having heads of its college that have been involved in the field. Michael Lanfier, one of your co-authors, was a former head of this college. I've been involved with the Center for Refugee Studies since I came to York University and served as an interim director. So we have this fine tradition in terms of McLaughlin College and refugee studies and forced migration studies. Howard, I think you've got at least 23 or 25 books to your credit, 100 academic articles, and you were recognized for your contribution to the field by being appointed to the Order of Canada. So we're very honored to have you here to talk about President Trump and UNRWA. Welcome.
Thanks very much. I move this into the center. I think you keep it here to let people look at screens. If I'm in the center, you can look at me. It's not as nice as a screen, but let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the issue. In the second part, I'm going to mention a bunch of implications. And that's the only time you should make notes. And you should make notes of which of the implications interest you, because when we get to the end, which I'm not, because I'm not going to give the lecture on that, I want you to tell me which of the implications you're most interested in, and I'll discuss those. And then we'll have a conversation. The main part will be historical, actually, to give this whole issue a context. Now, the issue starts very simply, currently, with the U.S. canceling its contributions to UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. The budget of UNRWA is just over $1.2 billion. The United States used to give 40% of the budget. More recently, it's given just under 30% of the budget. So that's about $350 million. And at the beginning of 2018, the Trump administration clearly signaled they were going on a different route. Jared Kushner and Nikki Haley and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo all agreed to cut the first quarterly contribution in half in January, and said that they were determined to cut the budget. So we knew then the budget was eliminated, the contribution, at the end of August. So the United States doesn't give any more money, and you can imagine when you lose 30% of your budget, it creates a bit of a crisis. Now, let me give you the issues, of which there are many, and so I'm only mentioning some. And these are the ones where I asked you to make notes of the one or two, maybe three that really interest you, and those I'll discuss. First, there's the humanitarian aspects of this, the economic effects on the individuals, the refugees themselves, etc. When this aid gets cut, what happens to them? Secondly, there's been a stress in the last decade or two on making refugees self-sufficient. It's a slogan of UNHCR, etc. And Kushner's contention was that UNRWA was creating a culture of dependency. And so he argued that he was fitting into this new mode of encouraging self-sufficiency. Thirdly, Kushner said that UNHCR was corrupt and it was inefficient. And thirdly, it was an obstacle to peace. He made this in January when the cuts were was 50%. And they're really, each one, very contentious. Because it's true that there was an element of corruption in UNHCR and UNRWA, especially in the early days, and I can talk about that. But it's very questionable whether you call UNRWA corrupt. It's also questionable whether you call it inefficient, and I can talk about its efficiencies and inefficiencies. Most importantly, it's very questionable whether it's an obstacle to peace, and I can explain why that's the case. Fourthly, one of the results, and it's been not just this, there's a pattern, is to convert Palestinian refugees into economic refugees. Pressure on them to go and become economic nomads, find a home somewhere, etc. Most directly is to make them citizens of the country in which they reside. That's the main function of trying to kill UNRWA, to get the Arab countries to nationalize, give nationality to the Palestinian refugees, which Jordan has done from the beginning. A fifth issue is to examine the implications on Palestinian refugees as political subjects. That is, the central issue of a nation-state system is that everybody has to be a member of a state that offers them protection. If you don't have membership in a state, as a number of scholars, Lorenz and others have said, you don't have reality in the contemporary world. And so it's the issue of statelessness, it's the issue of how you become a political person, an agency in the world that allows you to move around, etc. And part of the insistence on closing UNRWA is to supposedly end the state, and it's questionable whether it will or will in fact enhance it. A sixth and very important issue is the effect of this on the principle of the right of return, and I'll spend a lot of attention on that one. Because that's a key ingredient in the peace negotiations, the key problem that has been. And I'll discuss that, and we'll discuss it in both principle and practice. Then there are more direct political implications, such as on the rivalry between Hamas and PLO, because this has an effect on that. The role of Israel and the effect on Israel. I can tell you some odd stories. I can just give you one as an indicator. When Canada gavelled the refugee talks as part of the multilateral talks on refugees, and I was a consultant on those, one of the proposals was to close down UNRWA. It wasn't coming from the bullying of Trump. It was coming from the idea that it divided the Palestinian community, we should strengthen Palestinian institutions and use the funds to give to the Palestinian Authority in the 90s and strengthen it, etc. And one of the shocking things we discovered that Israel opposed it. And opposed it, strongly opposed it, because they argued, well, that would just reduce the money coming into the Middle East, and in particular for the Palestinians, and Israel would be burdened with that responsibility as in controlling the West Bank and Gaza at the time. So there's the effect on Israel of this move and its change from when I was involved. The effect on Arab states in the region is it'll have a significant effect. The effect on the American commitment to refugees in general. The ones I'll indicate now are much more in refugee studies rather than international studies or regional studies. Because in 2017, the United States reduced its target of intake of refugees from 100,000 to 40,000, to 45,000 actually. It actually took in only 21,000. In 2018, the target's been reduced further to 25,000. So this attack on refugees is part of a larger context of attack on all the agencies that support refugees. The domestic politics of the United States are affected because of a large number of Democratic representatives from the House and senators filed a petition against the canceling of the funds for UNRWA. And it wasn't only the Democrats. When Kushner and Haley and Pompeo pushed this policy, they were opposed vociferously by the State Department, by the Pentagon, by the intelligence services. All argued that this would just increase instability in the region. The interesting thing is, Kushner didn't disagree. He didn't push back on that. What he said is, our goal can't be to keep things stable. And here I'm quoting his words. Sometimes you have to strategically risk breaking things in order to get somewhere. Those are his words. So they weren't out of sync on what they saw as the possibility, but one saw it as terribly troublesome and the other saw it as a possibly good thing. There is directly the effect on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And I've argued, as people in my writings, a few of you knew, that may be a red herring because the peace process has been dead for a long time, and all we've witnessed recently is the burial, which is my argument. But when you see it in the context of moving the embassy to Jerusalem, you see it in the context of pushing up the Palestinian diplomats from Washington and saying, go home. It's all part of a pattern of how the Trump administration attacks the peace process. Then there's the effects on the international refugee regime itself. And that has followed a pattern. There was a trend, and I'll talk about this quite a bit actually, of treating refugees as humanitarian subjects only. And then it became an issue to treat them as political subjects and how to give them political agency, which has been the main thrust over the last run. And it had to do also with a third stress, which began almost at the same time as UNRWA, which is the stress on universal rights within an international and social and global order. So it's neither a nation-state order nor an order of a clash of military regimes. It also has effect on countries like Canada. What you might not know is, unless you're in refugee studies, but it's obvious, is that Canada has shifted its security borders over the last 2 decades. Our security borders are no longer aligned with our political borders. We engage in extraterritorial measures, numerous ones, visas, other devices, flying airlines, to keep refugees from coming to Canada. And this will be another effect on this because it will create additional pressures. Now, many of these subjects are for discussion. I'm not going to talk about any of them. I want you to tell me what you want to talk about. Now let me give you some background. Because without this background, I don't think I can even give you an answer to the questions. UNRWA has a history. UNHCR has a history. UNHCR is the major refugee agency in the world, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. It was founded in 1950. A year before, its big brother was founded, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. Like in many cases, particularly in biblical stories, the second-born ends up being the winner in the historical stakes to take over the major responsibility. UNHCR's major goal is to find permanent solutions for refugees, either by getting them back home and repatriating them, settling them in countries of first asylum, or resettling them in other countries like Canada. UNHCR currently takes care of about 68 million refugees. There's lots of questions I could talk about those figures, but that's roughly it. Its budget, I said the UNRWA budget is 1.2 billion. Well, UNHCR's budget is 7 point something billion, 7.7 I think, and means it's 6.5 times the size of UNRWA's. But it has 12.5 times the number of refugees it takes care of. So it has double the load for every dollar. UNRWA is responsible for 5 million registered refugees, which includes the descendants of the original 720,000 Palestinian refugees who fled. As I will tell you, there are 750,000 who were displaced, and I'll talk about that difference. There are very few, relatively. No, we don't have a count, but maybe 50,000, 100, 150,000 left of those original refugees. There have been some estimates, but I don't know how reliable they are. In any case, most of the original group have passed away. Now, when UNRWA was created, it was created, as its title suggests, to provide relief and works. It was a development project. It was modeled on other ways of treating refugees, and modeled very directly on the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was to build dams, and there were plans for dams in Iraq, and the refugees would be resettled in Iraq, and they'd be given land, etc. Lots of schemes developed, especially when the Canadians were heading UNRWA. So they would be given employment and presumably citizenship in Iraq. Now, the point is, a target was Palestine refugees, not Palestinian refugees. And Palestine refugees meant at the time refugees from Palestine, who were displaced by the war between the Palestinians and between the Israelis and the Arabs. The Palestine refugees included 37,000 Jewish refugees who were displaced by the war. They came off the UNRWA list in 2 or 3 years. Before its first term, there were 3-year terms. And the problem was taken over by Israel. So since then, everybody really thinks of UNRWA as the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees and not Palestine refugees. At the same time, there were 720,000 Arab refugees who fled or were expelled from their homes in what became post-1948 Israel. And I can give you a breakdown of the numbers from Morocco and Iraq and Iran Jews because there were refugees from Iran and Turkey as well. These were Jews who were forced out by pogroms, etc., and fled. Mostly, about 75% of them went to Israel. So Israel assumed responsibility for 37,000 refugees, and the Arab refugees, 3/4 of them, Jewish refugees who fled from Arab and other countries in the Middle East, and granted them citizenship and second. Jordan, to its great credit, also gave credit, membership in its state to Palestinian refugees. But unlike any other refugees in the world, though they had citizenship, they were still called refugees. Their education wasn't financed, as in later years, but initially their welfare wasn't financed by the Jordanese government. As it developed and as UNRWA never had enough money, Jordan took over more of the responsibility for facilitating, but there always remained two different education and welfare organizations, both in a country like Jordan and in the West Bank and other places which dealt with Palestinian refugees. In Syria and Egypt, which controlled Gaza, in Iraq, they didn't grant citizenship to the refugees. In Lebanon, there was a direct opposition to granting citizenship. It wasn't just simply passive, we're not giving them citizenship. It was an ardent opposition because of the balances between Christians and Muslims in Lebanon. This would upset the balance. Now, unlike UNHCR, as I said, is focused on one group of refugees. But that had been the pattern prior to 1950. UNHCR was the innovation. UNRWA was the pattern that existed since the First World War, in which you focus on one geographical group of refugees with one institution, and that's what you did. They were dealt with not as people who needed permanent resettlement, but as an interim humanitarian measure. UNRWA was a humanitarian organization strictly and wasn't involved in finding political solutions. There are many examples of this in the period up to 1950. The biggest example is, of course, the German refugees, the 12 million to 14 million, who were relocated from the eastern states and forced out and resettled mainly in Germany, and which was already on its knees. And the great German miracle was that that managed to both absorb them and to thrive. It was seen, the political problem was solved because there was another principle at work at the time, which was called the transfer of populations. It went back earlier to the example, the Greek-Turkish conflict, where in the war after the First World War, they have the war, they have the displacement of Greeks and Turks, and the Greeks take the Greeks displaced, and the Turks take the Turks displaced. As you'll see, Israel keeps wedded to the transfer principle. So its mindset is set back in this pre-1950 era. In Europe, there were not only the German refugees, which is the main group, or the very largest group, there were also 300,000 Jewish refugees left in camps. This is 3 years after the war. People, 200,000 of them, had been in concentration camps, and Nazi horrible camps. And they were still in camps for 2-3 years after the war. Why? Because the countries didn't want them. Canada still, which during the war and prior to the war had its policy towards Jews of none is too many, after the war continue that policy. It's not as if they said, okay, Nazis a terrible regime, we'll now take the Jews. No, they didn't want to take Jews. It was still there as part of, and changes in 48, and rapidly all kinds of other changes take place that Canada becomes a leader in taking refugees. But at the time it wasn't done. At the time, different agencies took over. In the case of the refugees, for instance, there was a survey done in 47. 46 was the first survey done of Jews in the camps, and most Jews wanted to go to states of Canada or Australia, maybe 60% in that survey. By 47 in the survey, 90% wanted to go to Israel. One motivation is because nobody else would have them, and Israel wanted them. But of course, Britain prevented them until May 15th from going to Israel. So as I said, there were special organizations. There was, for example, UNRWA, different UNRWA, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, it was called, for the European refugees. And it became the IRO, the International Refugee Organization. So you have different systems, different geographies, different outlets, different principles, transfer principles. And this was part of official doctrine. It wasn't just practice. At Potsdam in 45, Russia and America and Britain agreed in that conference to recognize officially the transfer of Germans from Hungary, from Poland, from etc., Czechoslovakia, back to Germany. That was official policy. That's how we solved the Palestinian, you solved the European refugee problems. That was the approach to all refugee problems in the 50s, in the 40s. And so it was natural that that would be the expectation of how to deal with the Palestinian refugees. There was always the clause in these transfer principles of this famous phrase, doing it in an orderly and humane manner. And that was absolute bullshit. In the German transfer, it's estimated that over 1 million Germans died in being repatriated. I mean, it's an enormous casualty rate. So it was never humane, never orderly. In the case of Jews, as I said, in the case of Jews from Arab lands as well as from Europe, there were countries that wouldn't take them. Now, Israel has stuck with this policy of transfer. It said, well, we took in the Jewish refugees from Arab lands, we took care of the Jewish internally displaced in Palestine, and we take care of the Palestinians. Both the same numbers, let's have reciprocity. They went further. Israel set up what was called transfer committees, or the transfer committee, actually, which was to try to push what was on the ground as a fait accompli. They weren't coming back, and that was official Israeli policy. It went further even in the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages, just destroyed to the ground so that there was no place to come back to. Now that was in part because of the terms of UNRWA. And you have to see the Arab point of view on this. At the time, the Arabs saw the refugees as a side issue. They didn't have to push them returning because they would return with armies and they would destroy Israel and then they could go back. So it was just a continuation of war. There was no consideration that we have to worry about a permanent settlement of refugees. That'll get solved when we beat the hell out of Israel and get rid of this terrible country. It was certainly the belief of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And that was created in '64. The solution was a military solution. And an understandable one, because if you do the study of all the refugees and all the issues on return, the only returns you can find, such as the Tutsis in Rwanda after the genocide there, the only return you can find is when they return behind a military force. So it wasn't unrealistic to have this doctrine instead of some doctrine of some abstract principle. Now, the basic term of UNRWA was set up with Article 11. And Article 11 spelled out that, what became interpreted as a right of return. But in fact, it wasn't a right of return at the time. It spelled out that essentially that the refugees should be permitted to return. And permitted to return, this is in Resolution 194, and should be permitted to return on condition of accepting peace. And that they would live in peace with their Jewish neighbors. Those were the principles of return. It was conditional. It was conditional on the Israel government agreeing. It was conditional upon them wanting to return in peace. And furthermore, it was had a second option, which was compensation. And the belief was overwhelmingly compensation would be paid. And Israel said, yeah, we'll pay compensation when the Arab countries pay compensation to the Jews who fled all those Arab states were forced to flee. Let me read the clause. Resolves that refugees wishing to return to their homes, and I'll come back to that clause, returning to their homes, and live at peace with their neighbors, should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss of or damage of property which under principles of international law or in equity should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. And that also is an important part of the clause. There was no charge that Israel, or expectation that Israel alone should be in charge. But in the diplomacy of the time of creative ambiguity, they used this phrase because Israel insisted that all the Arabs, it's their fault, they invaded us, they should pay the price. Arab countries and other countries argued Israel should pay the price. After all, they fled because they feared Israel, or Israel forced them out, percentage each. And therefore Israel would pay. So they word this clause as they'll settle it down the line. We'll give this general clause, and we won't determine who should be responsible for the compensation. But the main meaning of the clause was hortatory. It changed. It became a categorical imperative. It became a must return as a necessary a priori condition of a peaceful outcome. But that didn't occur until the 80s. It took a long time to develop from a recommendation and this kind of principle to becoming a central principle of the Palestinian movement. And it became a central principle only when the Palestinians, the PLO in particular in 1988, changed its covenant and said, we'll recognize Israel in return for peace. So there then became a recognition of Israel implicit at first, as David here, and it was worked on it, that becomes explicit by the 90s. Because up until then, the vision was we're going to eliminate Israel. So it didn't matter. Now this process of transferring the interpretation of the clause took place earlier. PLO was late in the game, but took place by the international community by the mid-75s. 76, the UN passes a resolution that says it's about a right of return. And the clause, I think it's 3236, said, in fact, that's what it means. It means a right of return. It doesn't mean just accommodation. So you have these interpretive problems, you have these political contextual problems, and you have others. David and I were involved in Channel 2 diplomacy, and we both remember Rashid Khalidi comes up with a formula, I think it was at York University when he was here, but I can't remember, I have to ask you that. When he comes up with a formula that it's not about return to home and their original homes, it's return to homeland. So there'll be an exchange of land for peace, there'll be a Palestinian state on West Bank and Gaza, and it can return to a Palestinian state, not their own original homes. So that becomes another period of transformation and argument, which gradually gets to be the meaning of the term, but even that's contentious, because if you go to the right in Israel, they oppose even the right of return to Palestinian state, because, oh, that'll create a security problem for us. We want to keep control of it, we want to keep control of security, etc. So no, we can't grant them that. We want to keep control of security. So it's not just a given that you can change it. But the major change that has to be recognized is you have a fundamental premise that changes from a humanitarian goal to a rights foundation. The right of return becomes right, stress on rights. And they had a right. It was a funny kind of right because nobody else had experienced it. Nobody else would ever experience it from any kind of analysis of what happened in practice. But unlike other rights, which are in practice universal as well as in theory, this was a right that wasn't universal by any empirical definition. So you had a problem, its own agency, refugees with its own agency, refugees with its own principles that change over time, and evolve into this direction of rights, which was the main premises of the UNHCR, becomes now a premise of UNRWA, but in a very different sense. Not individual rights, but collective rights of the people to be expressed individually. And it wasn't about settlement or settlement of countries of first asylum or resettlement. It was still repatriation. That begins to go with the negotiations in Oslo. The shift in Oslo, and I was directly involved in it, so I have a good understanding of it, was how to get the right of return to become Rashid Khalidi's answer, a right to return home, and get both sides on it. I mentioned very early that Israel opposed paying for this in terms of it, said they shouldn't be responsible. But also, Israel opposed the elimination of UNRWA. And that, I found it very surprising at the time when we interviewed the Israeli authorities and the Israeli political figures. And they said, look, we're realistic. If they wind up UNRWA, the money won't come from the other routes. It's a given. It comes this way and is a habit, and they give it automatically. So if they dry it up, we'll get stuck with the bill, and we can't afford it. That was their argument. And so you didn't have the Palestinians on side, you didn't have the Israelis on side, and so the habit of funding UNRWA continued until this last crisis. It is a real crisis. It's not a minor one. It has enormous effects. And what I want to do is now open it to discussion of what those effects were and which ones you're interested in discussing. I gave you a list of 15, I think. So I'll open conversation up to you. David, you asked the first question.
So I'll ask the first one.
Okay.
So I know a little bit about this country. I don't know much about anywhere else. And I have a right of return because I have a document that says I was born in Kitchener, Ontario. It's my birth certificate. But a lot of these people you're talking about don't have credentials. So it's difficult for these stateless people you're talking about. You talk about them as a collective, but actually they're a group of individuals. And what you need to get expedited is a good set of credentials. Now the other thing I just wanted to bring up with you is, if I go on the internet, I can find a castle in Scotland. I said I can find a castle in Scotland that I can purchase for $134,000. The city of Detroit has all kinds of locations that just deserted. There are towns in Canada that are deserted. So it's not that there's no infrastructure where we as this country couldn't bring these people, and I'm thinking about Rohingya now, or the Syrians, where they couldn't get up and ready and integrated within 10 years if there's a proper educational system. And I say that to you in the context of the fact that my mother was a refugee from Bolshevik Russia, came here, didn't speak English, worthless rubles and fur coats, and ended up in the Canadian Nursing Corps as a war veteran in the 40s, World War II.
Okay, let me answer your question in terms of credentials, in terms of areas where there's lots of places, room for them, and the role of education, etc. I'll do it with the role of education first. When UNRWA transfers from an aid agency to effectively the Ministry of Education and Welfare for the Palestinian refugees, which comes about in 1960. It's in that area that the transfer takes place. And the result is that in the Arab world, the Palestinian refugees are the best educated of any group in the Middle East. The UNRWA schools are pretty good, relatively. There's universal education for girls and boys, and this succeeds as an educational exercise. The shift, it's a case of a successful development. So it's not as if that's a big blank. You have this enormous reservoir of very educated people. If you go through the Middle East and you travel to different Arab countries, etc., you find enormous numbers of teachers of Palestinian backgrounds. They occupy different positions. The real problem was in Lebanon, when you interviewed Palestinians in Lebanon, they couldn't get security in their jobs. They'd be teaching, they could be university professors, but they had no security. They'd get a one-year contract which would be renewable. Now, where could they be settled? You're quite right that there's lots of places. Detroit downtown is a wasteland that needs people, and it has all kinds of policies now to resettle its downtown area. There are castles in Scotland. We went on a trip to Quebec just a week ago, and we visited the Eastern Township, and we saw this wonderful winery, really beautiful winery, 172 acres, with a huge, monstrous semi-castle, with 2 separate houses, with a chapel, with ponds. It was just a great enterprise. For sale for $2,950,000. It cost at least $2,950,000 to build the cellars, the wine cellars of this place. It was phenomenal. So there are all kinds of places like that people can be settled, but the problem is we're in an urban culture. People want to live and need to live in urban environments. Now that may change with the internet, etc. I'm not a specialist on that. So there's not, the question of room isn't the issue. You're right, there's room. let's do the question of credentials. But here you're not correct. There are credentials. The Palestinian refugees were registered. They were registered in 49, and they have a great system of registration. Initially, there were 960,000 Palestinian refugees registered. Now, as it turned out, in later audits, it showed that about 25% of those were fraudulent, which is consistent with what we did research in Dadaab refugee camp, all kinds of refugee camps, because when they dole out ration cards to people in camps, if you collect a few more ration cards, you can survive and you can sell and trade them, etc. And so getting other people, your uncle or your nephew or your dead grandfather, on the list is very important. And it was fairly easy to get somebody in line to register as that person and get it there. That gradually, it took a long time actually to get eliminated. So that's the original so-called corruption. But it's a corruption endemic in all refugee camp life. I'll give you an example. I'm living in Dadaab refugee camp, and there's the annual census being done. 40 busloads come from Nairobi back to the refugee camp with refugees who are getting in to register back that they're in the camp. They're working in Nairobi, they're living in Nairobi, but because they get back to the camp, they can give their relatives their registration cards so that they can get these food allotments. And since the calorie intake for each food allotment was only 1,400 calories, which is a starving diet, it's understandable that people do it. It isn't, some great attempt at criminality. It's an attempt at survival using perhaps illegal means. So I think I try to answer those. Who's next? Go ahead.
Well, first a pre-question. Would you not agree that if the Palestinian refugees had been settled after the war, 47-48 war, in Arab countries, that would have removed the major card that the Arabic and Muslim world has to play internationally against Israel?
Yeah, I would agree, but it's a hypothetical.
But it does suggest a direct incentive not to resolve the problem. The UNRWA was basically set up to guarantee the continual existence of the Palestinians.
Okay, my argument is the two things. UNRWA was not set up for that purpose.
Well, the
Just
driving force.
that was not its purpose originally. It became that, and became an instrument of that, no question about it. But that wasn't its original mandate. Secondly, if the Arab states had been willing to settle, there's no question it would have helped solve the problems. They would have benefited. They would have gotten all this energy and talent. And everybody would have been better off, and there would have been a big objective element of the violence eliminated by, because the more radical elements come from camps like Camp Jenin. If you visit the camps, you find greater radicalism among Palestinians than among people in urban areas who hadn't been uprooted. So that's all true, but it's a hypothetical truth, because at the time, the convictions of the Arab states were that Israel was an interloper. Israel was an interloper, and they're going to eliminate it. It didn't belong in the Middle East. And that was their conviction. Secondly, their conviction was they could do it. The only reason they couldn't do it in 48 because they were under colonial, post-colonial regimes, and the governments in the West had helped Israel. I mean, a lot of fraud in this, but that's their vision. There was no possibility of them accepting the Palestinians as refugees. They were part of the political equation, not part of a humanitarian equation for them. So that takes time to overcome. That isn't their attitude now, but that attitude changed in a number of ways. One is they're far more critical of the Palestinians than I mean, I remember when I was first introduced, and you had all these Palestinian teachers, and the last time I did this work, which was a few years ago, the antagonism towards the Palestinians was paid. Certainly when I went to Lebanon in '82 and did my research there was no question these guys, they were happy the Israelis were eliminating them. I'm in Beirut, I'll give you an example, I'm in Beirut in a refugee camp, and the Israelis start bombing the camp. Their artillery, which is outside the city. Now Beirut is traffic jams, cranes, building buildings, etc. And this equivalent to about a 6 square block area is being bombarded. And nobody's paying any attention. They're all going around their bloody business. And they don't care. And they want the Palestinians to be driven out because they saw them as creating the trouble for Lebanon. So you get this shift in attitudes that happens over the period. And means that Egypt would sign a peace agreement, Jordan would sign a peace agreement, other elements coming up. And I didn't discuss this, but one of the big issues in the peace agreement debates was should we focus on the Syrian front or the Palestinian front? And it went back and forth. And there's big debates of what should have happened and could have happened. But it didn't happen, so we got neither a peace agreement with Syria nor a peace agreement with Palestinians. Next question. Go ahead, David.
Just picking up on this last exchange, more just to add more empirical information. When I was in Damascus in 2005 and 2006, it was made very clear to me by not just government, but dissidents, academics, people leading the private sector, that their large Palestinian camps were unwelcome. And they would be strongly supportive of an effort that would lead to interstate peace, that would resolve or address some of the Palestinian issues and get the Palestinians as refugees out of Syria. So that's very, very strong views. Now, that came after a couple of years after the Saudis floated the Arab peace plan. And the Israelis didn't respond to it. The Israelis have never responded to it. The Saudi peace plan, though there were some conditions, but they were not.
They weren't donors.
Pardon me?
They weren't donors. It's
No.
a peace plan.
And they were interstate.
Yeah.
Between Arab states and Israel. And the issue of the Palestinians was supposed to be on the other side of the Green Line. He gave the Palestinians what they had before 1967 with some adjustments. Not an issue. And UNRWA, as far as I know, was never part of those
Never part of it.
conversations. So, I guess I'm curious about the Kushner comment about you have to break something to innovatively, out of necessity, create something new that's more workable. I'm wondering what you really think about that. You've got now the Palestine Authority. You have a Hamas for all its problems, but another center of authority. You have Hezbollah, which is another center of Palestinian authority. And you have what's going on in the West Bank with, as I said, with the Palestine Authority. So I'm wondering if Kushner might not be right to force the issue of, do we need this international organization? Do we need an international body? Do we need a different one? Because of the baggage that UNRWA comes with and the way it's used and has not seemingly led to dramatic change in the welfare of Palestinians in recent years.
Well, I'll answer that question twofold. One, I'm terribly reluctant to give the Trump administration any credit for anything.
I agree.
That's a bias. The second bias is I'm a Canadian, and you are too. And we come up with a bias about Canadian diplomacy. and Canadian diplomacy being based. I mean, when I did this work, the ambassador said to me, "Howard, you're never going to be a Canadian diplomat. We can't put you in any diplomatic role. Why? Because you're a philosopher. You believe in clear and distinct ideas. We believe in creative ambiguity because that's the only way you get problem solved." So Canadians don't believe in destruction in order to do recreation. It's gradualism. It's tempering your pace, your attitude, your approach. So we come as Canadians to these peace negotiations, and sometimes we're irrelevant, and sometimes we're very relevant, such as when the Canadian refugee talks were the front used to get the first Palestinians recognized as a separate delegation of Jordan, to get the PLO first recognition as representing the Palestinians. That all happened at the refugee talks, not at the bilateral talks. So there are these different routes and these different concepts, and there my bias comes in that makes me difficult for me to answer the question. Are they right? They may be. I hate to say it. They may be.
I'd say they're wrong.
Let me finish, please.
Yeah. And I don't know the answer, you see. I admit the possibility, but I tend to think that taking a destructive path takes so much greater risks, and the possibilities of losing control are so much greater. It's crazy not to take the gradualism path, and the path of words and the path of exchanges, that in the long run that works for everybody much better than these hard bullying, pressure tactics that they're using. That's my tendency, but I'm not very confident that I'm right there.
Tversky and Kahneman would say that one of our inherent problems is risk aversion.
Yeah.
And we act more, not in terms of available gains, but to decrease possible losses.
That's right. But you see, if you use Kahneman and Tversky in behavioral psychology, not only in economics but in politics, and you say that, we also know it varies with cultures. So that Canadians are probably the most risk-averse culture in the world. Israelis are part of the most risk-prone cultures in the world.
But not with the Palestinians.
Well, they take an ambivalent attitude. Sometimes risky, sometimes thing. I mean, they're pretty cautious in Gaza. People don't know it. They're much more cautious about Gaza. They're certainly cautious about UNRWA, but Netanyahu has endorsed the hard line now, get rid of UNRWA, which wasn't the traditional Israeli policy. So it's a mixed game, and we're bystanders largely and watch it and make comments on it. We have no influence.
So,
just another question here.
So you mentioned earlier that the Israeli public generally has a caution towards two-state solution and giving partial listing to the Palestinian state. And I've spent some time living in Israel, and I see that there is a very clear common theme with what people believe, that they believe in a Palestinian state theoretically, but in practice it could turn into another Gaza, where Hamas is elected and you have that whole mess.
Good summary. Go ahead.
So if you would respond to any of those concerns that the Israeli people would have, how would you respond to that?
Well, I don't know the answer. Just to start off the answer. It's terribly difficult because you had, when we were doing our work in Track 2 diplomacy, we had a majority of Israelis favoring the two-state solution. The idea of independent Gaza and unilateral withdrawal came from the left, not the right. Sharon implemented it. I can tell you the person who wrote the original art was a philosopher, and wrote the piece on what to do, etc. The results were catastrophic, not only for what happened in Gaza, but what happened to the Jewish refugees who were from Gaza were repatriated, how Israel treated them. So Israel doesn't want to repeat that trauma. Israel also doesn't want to be torn apart, and has very deep divisions on this. And there are deep divisions on when to gamble. And you notice the divisions are within the institutions. So just like I mentioned in the United States, you have the division of the Pentagon, Intelligence Service, and the State Department being on one side, and the White House being on the other side. The same is true in Israel. The intelligence services, the IDF, are much more cautious in dealing with Palestinians. They have all kinds of cooperative security arrangements with them, so they don't want to upset. And Netanyahu was a minor bully compared to Trump, but a bully nevertheless. And so out of his office comes a whole different thing, and the divisions are enormous. But the public largely now is very skeptical, very suspicious, and that wasn't the case. It's one of the problems you have when you resort to violence. You increase the fears on the other party and their reluctance to ever make a deal. So if you do a disruptive technique, if it doesn't work, and the chances are in most cases it doesn't work, you create long-term distrust, and long-term distrust makes it very hard, much harder to have a peace agreement. Okay?
Well, if UNRWA is eliminated tomorrow, it doesn't mean necessarily or even likely that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are going to be starving. The people are talking about two forms of replacing them. One is funding agencies in the Palestinian Authority area directly, hospitals, schools, sanitation. If this money is controlled by Western governments, there's going to be far, far less corruption, virtually, probably zero corruption at our end. But they will have the means to eliminate corruption at the reception end. And it would just be a question of getting rid of an agency which is, in my view, stood in the way of any kind of reception, but still financing the lives of Palestinians. And maybe at the same time applying more pressure, which I think the West has never really done, on Arab and Muslim countries to accept a quota of Palestinian refugees.
Okay, a number of issues raised there. You're quite right that there are alternative funds. My great-grandson was born in a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem. And it is now funded, not in a traditional way, but by overseas agencies as part of a reconciliation process with the institution. And it's a really good hospital. It gets Israelis going there because it is in the avant-garde of supporting natural childbirth and things like that, even though it's a traditional Catholic hospital. So there is certainly the fact that there's already in works openings to replace funding. Secondly, the funding is relatively very small. It's $70 a person. Given the GDP of Palestine might be 1/3 of Israel, but it's still in the order of $16,000 or something. They're not a thing. Adding $70 one way to the average for just the Palestinian refugees is not a huge thing. There will not be starvation. There will not be the end of education. There won't be the end of health services for Palestinian refugees. Especially as we know, some of the countries have stepped up to fill the gap, more because of their hatred of Trump than their love of Palestinian refugees. So you're right on that ground. On the third ground, how relevant is UNRWA to the peace process? I think it is relevant as a symbol, not relevant very much as on the ground. If you go to Gaza and you look at the UNRWA school books compared to the Hamas school books, they almost look like they love Israelis. That's not true, they're biased, etc. But in comparison to the Hamas books, there's no comparison. They're reasonable. You understand the stress, at least, even in the distortions, but it's not crazy like the Hamas school books. So there's one sense in which UNHCR and UNHCR schools are part of the moderation in the Palestinian community rather than extremism. Fourthly, there's another dilemma because I asked one of the issues about what does it do with Hamas versus the Palestinian Authority. I don't know this field well enough, but reading the guys who do, I get the interpretation, and David can speak up here too, is that eliminating UNRWA, the pressure to put UNRWA, helps the extremists more than the moderates. And that's a danger. So it's weighing these risks and benefits. And David's right, I think, and Kahneman and Tversky are right, that we tend to make judgments based on minimizing risks, even for a risky culture like Israel, than on what's the best outcome possible. And so that all influences what you can do and what you should do. Question back there?
Talking about the Palestinians' right to return,
Yeah.
as well, in terms of like recent events, especially with like the expansion of Israel's settlements as well, and Israel's more control of like areas of the West Bank and Gaza, is like the right of return for these Palestinian refugees realistic at this point? Like, is like this right of return like the thing that could actually happen?
Good question. I think so, but let me explain why. You're quite right about the expansion of settlements, but the expansion of settlements has to be understood in the aftermath of Oslo and the division of the West Bank into A, B, and C. The expansion has been largely in Area C. They've also done de facto, not de jure, ethnic cleansing in Area C. So that the Palestinian population in Area C used to be at the time of Oslo 650,000, down to 150,000. So it's largely Jewish areas now. And so the trade-off in areas, for Omar it was 100%, but for Barak it was 96%. Whether it's 96% or 100% trade-off, there'd be equivalent territories for people to go to. And whether it becomes a state side by side Israel, as the Israeli left, which is decreasing in its power, wants, or whether it's an autonomous political entity under the security control of Israel, it still becomes a place where they can come back to. The dilemma of the last position is, of course, when you don't get full sovereignty, you don't get control over who enters here and becomes a member. And that's why that solution is very questionable, because it would also lead to the continuation of the Palestinian refugee problem, in my mind, because I think the right would push not to have them repatriated even to Palestine. But it's still realistic for the present, because even on the right, that's a minority view now. But given trends, the trend is against that. The trend is increasingly becoming bullish, tough-minded, not worrying about this kind of thing, let them find another solution for them. So it's less humanitarian, and that's part of the dilemma. Timing is very important. I mean, we cried when Arafat screwed the Oslo deal. We did. We had worked hard years, and just flaky, kind of stupid decisions. And Abbas has never had stature and ability to really do it. And since you've had the Israeli right in power, they have not wanted to do it. So you have a formula for disaster, and that's a dilemma. Any other questions? You, David, you had a final remark.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Bill, you passed. Anything else? That's why I did that then. You can talk before me. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Howard, thank you so much for your presentation and all of your insights in terms of the situation with the 30% cut in UNRWA's budget. Hopefully it won't generate the kind of instability that may lead to an escalation of difficulties in the Middle East. So thank you so much for your presentation.